In the winter of 1258, as the winds swept across the plains of Mesopotamia, a sense of foreboding fell over the ancient world. Something vast, unstoppable, and merciless was approaching. A force unlike anything the Middle Ages had ever witnessed. The people who lived in the great cities of the Islamic world whispered to each other in fear, as caravans arrived, carrying stories of entire kingdoms swallowed in days, of cities erased in hours, of rulers who bent the knee or were buried beneath the ruins of their own palaces. The Mongols were coming, but Baghdad, proud, wealthy, ancient Baghdad, still believed it could not fall. For over 5 centuries, it had been the center of the world, a beacon of knowledge, a treasury of science, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, literature, and culture. If Europe was the land of kings and castles, Baghdad was the city of minds and miracles. Yet in that winter, as riders appeared on the horizon and the sky grew darker with each passing day, the fate of this legendary city, and of the entire medieval world, was about to change forever. To understand how the forgotten war reshaped the Middle Ages, one must first imagine Baghdad as it truly was. In the 13th century, the city was not merely a place on a map, it was a universe. The Caliph lived at its center, surrounded by advisors, scholars, poets, and scientists. The libraries overflowed with manuscripts. The markets roared with languages from every corner of the known world. Astronomers charted the movements of stars from observatories that seemed to touch the heavens. Doctors practiced advanced surgery with techniques unknown in Europe for centuries. It was a civilization thriving in brilliance, even as its political strength quietly decayed from within. At the heart of this world stood the House of Wisdom, a library so vast, so precious, and so essential that many considered it the greatest repository of human knowledge ever assembled. Within its walls, ancient Greek texts survived because scholars had translated them centuries before. Mathematics from India, astronomy from Persia, medical discoveries from Arabia, all accumulated here. It was a lighthouse of knowledge shining across the medieval world. But empires rarely fall because of a single blow. They fall because of a series of smaller cracks that go unnoticed until the collapse becomes inevitable. Baghdad, though magnificent, rested on old foundations. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once dominated the Islamic world, had shrunk to little more than a ceremonial core. Local powers had risen elsewhere: the Seljuks, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks. The caliph's authority was symbolic, spiritual, cultural, but not military. The armies that once defended the empire had dwindled. Corruption had crept into the palace. Factions plotted behind curtains. And in the east, beyond deserts and mountains, a storm was building that no one in Baghdad fully understood. While Baghdad basked in its legacy, the Mongol Empire under Hulagu Khan was rewriting the rules of war. His grandfather had been Genghis Khan, a name that still struck terror into the hearts of kings. Hulagu inherited not only the military machine of the Mongols, but also their worldview: diplomacy first, annihilation second. Those who submitted lived. Those who resisted vanished. Every city along his path was a message to the next: resist, and you will be destroyed. Hulagu's army marched with precision and purpose. Tens of thousands of cavalry, archers whose arrows darkened the sky, engineers capable of constructing siege weapons, more advanced than anything the medieval world had seen. Each soldier carried with him stories of cities that had refused the Mongols and were wiped out. When their banners appeared on the horizon, fear traveled ahead of them like a ghost. Baghdad had received warnings. Envoys had come, demanding submission. Caliph al-Mustasim refused, believing that God and history would protect him. He underestimated the Mongols, a mistake from which the world would not recover for centuries. And so Hulagu assembled what would become the largest Mongol force ever deployed in the Middle East. They crossed the Zagros Mountains like a wave of steel and fire. One by one, the cities on the outskirts of Baghdad fell. Resistance was crushed. Messages from fleeing survivors reached the capital, but the court remained divided. Some advisors insisted that the Mongols were bluffing. Others begged the caliph to prepare defenses, to negotiate, to flee, anything but stand idle. Yet pride, tradition, and indecision engulfed Baghdad at the worst possible moment. By January of 1258, the Mongol army encircled the city. They constructed siege lines, dug trenches, and brought forth massive catapults capable of hurling boulders weighing hundreds of pounds. Chinese engineers directed the machines, combining their expertise with Mongol discipline and Persian siegecraft. Baghdad's walls had never been tested by such force. For centuries, the city had relied on diplomacy, religion, and prestige for protection, not military readiness. As the first stones crashed into the walls, the truth became undeniable. Baghdad was unprepared. The siege began with a ferocity that stunned even the defenders. Massive projectiles soared over the walls, smashing into towers, homes, and markets. Fires erupted across the city. Arrows rained down on anyone who dared approach the battlements. The Mongols, knowing the power of water, diverted sections of the Tigris River to weaken the foundations of the defensive walls. Day and night, without pause, they hammered the city. Inside, panic spread. Food grew scarce. Soldiers deserted. Civilians begged the caliph to surrender, but it was too late. After only 12 days, the walls that had stood for centuries cracked and collapsed. The Mongols surged into the city, their cavalry sweeping through the streets with disciplined precision. What happened next would echo through history like a nightmare. The sack of Baghdad was not a simple act of conquest. It was devastation on a scale that the medieval world had never witnessed. For 7 days, the Mongols carried out a systematic destruction of the city's population and institutions. They did not loot chaotically. They executed methodically. Scholars, scientists, poets, philosophers, those who represented the intellectual heart of the Islamic world, were targeted and killed. Administrators were executed. Markets were burned. Homes were destroyed. But nothing symbolized the tragedy more than the fate of the House of Wisdom. As the Mongols stormed the Great Library, manuscripts that had survived for centuries were torn, burned, or thrown into the Tigris. Observers would later claim that the river ran black with ink from countless books and scrolls, dissolving in the water. The knowledge of entire civilizations, Greek, Persian, Indian, Arab, perished in days. The Mongols were not simply destroying a city, they were extinguishing a light that had illuminated the world for centuries. Baghdad, once the jewel of the Middle Ages, was reduced to ashes. Yet this forgotten war did not only destroy, it transformed. The fall of Baghdad reshaped the political landscape in ways few could have predicted. With the Abbasid Caliphate effectively dissolved, the Islamic world entered a new era of fragmentation and reorganization. The Mongols, who had seemed unstoppable, now controlled vast territories stretching from Central Asia into the heart of the Middle East. Europe watched in terror. Crusader states, already weakened, understood that if Baghdad could fall, no city was safe. In royal courts from Paris to London, rulers whispered about the possibility of Mongol armies appearing at their borders. But amid the darkness, a new force began to rise. The Mamluks of Egypt. Former slave soldiers, hardened by training, discipline, and loyalty to their commanders, the Mamluks were perhaps the only military power capable of confronting the Mongols. News of Baghdad's fall shocked Cairo. It was a warning and a call to action. Under the leadership of Sultan Qutuz and the brilliant commander Baybars, the Mamluks began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They studied Mongol tactics, fortified their cities, and forged alliances. They understood something few others did. The Mongols could be beaten, but only by matching their discipline with strategy, their speed with intelligence, and their fury with precision. And so, as the Mongols advanced westward, believing that nothing could stop them, the Mamluks waited. The confrontation between these two forces, one representing the greatest military power of the age, the other representing a new and rising strength, was inevitable. And it was this clash, born from the ashes of Baghdad, that would determine the fate of the Middle East, and ultimately, the future direction of the medieval world. As word of Baghdad's destruction spread across the Middle East, it carried with it the weight of dread, disbelief, and prophecy. Cities that had once looked to Baghdad for guidance now stood leaderless, orphaned by the fall of their cultural and spiritual center. Traders spoke in hushed tones about the Mongol horsemen who seemed to appear like ghosts, striking swiftly, vanishing into the horizon, and returning with even greater force. For many, the Mongols felt less like an army and more like a force of nature, something inevitable, unstoppable, destined to reshape the world. Yet in Egypt, a different sentiment began to take root. Defiance. Something in the air was shifting, something that even the Mongols had not anticipated. In Cairo, the Mamluks knew that they were all that stood between Hulagu's armies and the total collapse of the Islamic world. Their rulers had changed recently, their internal politics were far from stable, and they understood that victory would not come from faith alone. It would come from discipline, strategy, and a willingness to face death without hesitation. Unlike the aristocratic knights of Europe, the Mamluks had been forged quite literally from childhood in the art of war. Many were born as slaves, taken from the Caucasus or the steppes, trained intensely, and indoctrinated into military brotherhoods. In their world, loyalty was earned, not inherited. Their commanders were chosen based on merit, not lineage. Their system was ruthless but efficient, and at that moment in history, exactly what the world needed. When word reached Cairo that Hulagu Khan had withdrawn part of his forces to the east due to the death of the great Khan Munka, leaving a formidable but not invincible army in Syria, the Mamluk leadership recognized their opportunity. This was the moment to strike, before the Mongols regrouped and returned in overwhelming numbers. Sultan Qutuz, understanding the gravity of the situation, rallied his commanders, including the young but brilliant General Baybars. Together, they would orchestrate one of the most daring military operations of the Middle Ages. The Mongols, led by Kitbuka, a fierce and loyal general to Hulagu, advanced through Syria with confidence. They had grown accustomed to victory, accustomed to cities surrendering at the first sight of their banners. And why wouldn't they? They had crushed the greatest city in the world in mere days. But Syria was not Baghdad. And the Mamluks were not a divided political court. They were an army of hardened warriors who had everything to lose, and who understood the Mongols better than anyone else in the region. As both armies approached Palestine, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Middle East. The landscape around Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, offered natural advantages for the Mamluks. Hills, narrow passes, and dense vegetation provided the perfect terrain for ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and strategic retreats, all tactics the Mamluks mastered. Baybars, who had studied Mongol warfare extensively, devised a plan that would exploit the Mongols' greatest strength, their speed, and turn it into a weakness. On a cool morning in September 1260, as mist clung to the hills, the two armies finally met. The Mongols charged first, as was their custom, confident they would scatter the enemy as they had done countless times before. Their cavalry thundered across the valley, arrows filling the air in dark waves. But the Mamluk lines did not break. Baybars led the front line himself, riding alongside his soldiers, engaging the Mongols with fierce discipline. At times, he advanced aggressively. At others, he retreated just enough to lure the Mongols deeper into the valley, into the trap. Kitbuka, sensing what he believed was weakness, ordered his forces to press harder. The Mongols increased their speed, tightening their formation as they entered the valley. That was when the Mamluks sprung the trap. Hidden cavalry units, concealed behind the hills and vegetation, charged down upon the Mongols from both flanks. Arrows rained from every direction. The Mongol momentum faltered for the first time, caught between relentless attacks from the front and surprise assaults from the sides. But the battle was far from over. The Mongols, even when trapped, fought with a savagery unmatched by any contemporary army. They regrouped, counterattacked, and attempted to break the encirclement. Kitbuka himself led charges, cutting down Mamluk soldiers with brutal efficiency. The clash was unlike anything recorded in medieval warfare. A collision of two elite forces, each fully aware that defeat meant the end of their civilization. The valley echoed with the sound of steel, hooves, and the desperate cries of men. The fate of continents hung in the balance. Then came the decisive moment. Sultan Qutuz, who had remained behind the lines to oversee the broader strategy, saw the Mamluk center beginning to falter under the renewed Mongol assault. Without hesitation, he removed his helmet, shouted, "Wa Islama," and charged directly into the heart of the battle. His sudden appearance, bold and reckless, rallied the Mamluk troops. Reinforcements surged forward. Morale ignited. In that single moment, a decisive psychological shift occurred. Not only among his own men, but within the Mongol ranks as well. The pressure on the Mongols intensified until their formation broke. Kitbuka himself was captured and killed, refusing to retreat even when defeat became inevitable. Without their commander, and outmaneuvered by an enemy who had learned to adapt to their methods, the Mongol army collapsed. For the first time in open battle, the Mongols had been utterly defeated. And this victory did more than save Egypt. It halted Mongol expansion westward for good. The consequences were immense. If the Mamluks had fallen, the Mongols would have marched into Egypt, the heart of the Islamic world, and then toward North Africa. With Mediterranean ports under their control, Europe would have been exposed. There is no certainty as to how far they would have gone, but the patterns of their conquests suggest a chilling possibility. The Mongols might have reached as far as the Atlantic. Ain Jalut was not merely a battle. It was a turning point in history. In the aftermath of this forgotten war, the medieval world reshaped itself. The Islamic world, though wounded, found new strength under the Mamluks. Cairo rose to prominence, replacing Baghdad as the cultural and political capital. The Mamluks developed a sophisticated military system, fortified their cities, and transformed Egypt into one of the most powerful states of the late Middle Ages. Under their rule, the Islamic world regained stability, protected the holy cities, re-established trade networks, and fostered a new era of scholarship. The Mongols, meanwhile, fractured. Internal rivalries, succession disputes, and cultural integration changed the direction of their empire. They remained powerful, but no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. Hulagu established the Ilkhanate in Persia, which would eventually adopt Islam and contribute to a new wave of Persian cultural renaissance. The Mongol threat to the Middle East and Europe had been checked, not by chance, but by the strategic brilliance and sheer determination of the Mamluks. Europe, too, felt the impact of the forgotten war. For decades, rulers had watched Mongol movements with fear and fascination. They studied their tactics, fortified their cities, and sought alliances. The fall of Baghdad disrupted trade routes, pushing Europeans to turn increasingly toward maritime exploration, a shift that would later contribute to the Age of Discovery. Meanwhile, the destruction of the House of Wisdom created a vacuum in global knowledge that would not be filled for centuries. Scientific progress in the Islamic world slowed dramatically, while in Europe, preserved fragments of ancient knowledge began to grow into something new, something that would eventually become the Renaissance. Yet for all its consequences, the war remained strangely absent from popular memory. Perhaps it was too brutal, too tragic, too vast to fit neatly into the stories medieval chroniclers preferred to tell. Perhaps the West ignored it because it did not involve knights or crusaders in shining armor. Perhaps the Islamic world looked away because the memories were too painful. Or perhaps history is simply not kind to stories where entire civilizations burn. But the truth remains. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 and the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 reshaped the Middle Ages more profoundly than almost any other event of the era. In the ashes of Baghdad, the world lost not just lives, but centuries of accumulated knowledge. In the fields of Ain Jalut, the world witnessed the first true defeat of the Mongols in open battle, a moment that preserved entire civilizations. These two events, linked by destruction and resistance, formed the forgotten war that changed the medieval world forever. A war fought not for glory or conquest alone, but for the survival of identity, culture, and the very future of humanity. And yet most people today have never heard this story. They do not know the names of the scholars whose manuscripts vanished into the Tigris. They do not know the commanders who stood against an empire. They do not know the sound of Baghdad burning or the echo of cavalry charging through the valley of Ain Jalut. But now, you do. If this journey through the forgotten turning points of history moved you, join us as we continue exploring the shadows of the past. The medieval world holds countless secrets, stories erased, battles overlooked, and mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Medieval Times Uncharted and prepare for the truths history left behind.